Let's talk a little bit about Canada with Canada's own Jordan B. Peterson. He's the author of this book. It is called 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. When the book came out, it's now #1 on Amazon. He was on our couch, but we wanted Dr. Peterson to join us today. First off, Dr. Peterson, you put together this book after hearing from the people that talked to you after attending your lectures, right?
Yes, well, and before that as well. I've been writing it for about 5 years.
So the whole idea of 12 rules for life is what?
Well, people need guidelines in their life, and what I've done is to try to write a sequence of rules that are witty and sometimes obvious as well, I suppose, but to try to go deep down inside of them and to find out why it is that we need principles to live by, and also to point out that we do in fact need principles to live by to guide us towards a meaningful and productive life, and one that helps us deal with the tragedy and malevolence of existence.
Well, we'll all have to go pick that book up. Congratulations on it, making it to #1. You've been on our show quite a few times, and you are just so smart. So I think your advice is something that other people need to pick up and read through the pages. Thank you so much for also weighing in on some other topics affecting your area, Canada. You're in Toronto right now, and Justin Trudeau, he interrupts a woman at a town hall. She's asking him a question, and he didn't like one of the words that she used. Listen to this soundbite, and then we'll get your reaction.
All right.
So that's why we came here today to ask you to also look into the policies that religious charitable organizations have in our legislation so that it can also be changed, because maternal love is the love that's going to change the future of mankind. So we'd like you to look
we like to say people kind, not necessarily mankind, because it's more inclusive.
There we go, exactly.
And the crowd roars.
Yeah, well, it's quite the performance. I mean, I'm afraid that our Prime Minister is only capable of running his ideas on a few very narrow ideological tracks. We saw the first evidence of that when he put his cabinet together. He insisted upon making it 50% women, despite the fact that only about 22% of the elected MPs were women. And it was easier for him to do that than it was for him to screen people for the sort of competence that would actually be necessary to be cabinet members. So we've seen a fair bit of this behavior, but that was the most egregious example, I suppose.
Dr. Peterson, I recall you taking some heat because you said you would refuse to use these gender-neutral pronouns. Why was that?
Well, I actually said that I would refuse to use the pronouns that were mandated by law. Because they were mandated by law, I feel that it's completely inappropriate of the government to decide what language the citizenry should speak. There's never been an example of that in British common law history, and I believe that that was a very, very bad precedent. I didn't want to use language that I thought was generated by radical leftist propagandists, and so I said I wouldn't do it.
I saw one tweet this morning that said Neil Armstrong should have said one small step for people kind.
Yeah, well, you know, Trudeau was listening to an earnest woman try to discuss something important, and he interjected a ideological statement in the middle of the dialogue, and that indicates, I think, precisely the way he thinks. And I don't think he does think. I think he runs an ideology in his head and accepts the output without question. And I think we're really going to pay for it in Canada in ways that we can't yet imagine.
Well, we're going to find out, because you believe it's coming to us here in America, and you've been to both countries frequently. Now let's talk about something else that builds on your premise. This whole father-daughter dance that are being canceled around the country because of gender guidelines. Even Donald Trump Jr. weighed in with this quote: "The father-daughter dances inherently leave people out, not just because of transgender status, just life in general. These can be really uncomfortable, triggering events." That, according to Jared Fox, New York City Department of Education. So that's their response to cancel the dance, because there's a lot of people that can't go. Is there a problem with that?
Well, the problem with that is self-evident, but it's part of this absolute onslaught by the radical leftists on the fundamental normative structures of our culture. And if you're going to cancel everything that's triggering to everyone, then you're going to cancel everything altogether, because there isn't a single thing that anyone can ever say or do that isn't going to offend someone. And the idea that this is being done so that certain people's feelings won't be hurt, I think, is absolutely absurd. It's not compassion and care that's driving this. It's the desire to put forward a very pernicious ideology, and it's being very, very successful in its application.
But Dr. Peterson, they say that they're doing that to make things more inclusive.
Yeah, well, they say all sorts of things, and they are a very small, noisy, dangerous minority, and it's really appalling that we're bending over backwards to do their bidding without question, under the name of compassion.
A lot of my friends have been posting pictures of the daddy-daughter dance recently, and I think the pictures are so cute. Are little girls going to miss out on a memory?
Well, yes, for sure. And the thing is that even your terminology, when you're talking about little girls, is something that's going to be increasingly forbidden as we demolish the classic gender ideas. And no one's going to benefit from that.
And people
it's going to be a real catastrophe.
I mean, people are even talking about deciding on what gender they're going to be as youngsters.
Yeah, well, that's happening all over. It's an absolute epidemic, and we've decided that children as young as 3 or 4 can now decide what gender they are, and then undergo the appropriate surgical and biological alterations to bring their morphology in keeping with that. And it's a mistake of epic proportions, and we're going to pay for it in a big way.
We do hear of that, but how often does that happen?
It happens increasingly. Like in Britain in 2015, there were, I think, 57 kids in the gender dysphoria clinics, and last year there were 2,000.
All right. He's got a great book out there, great number-wise right now. #1 in Amazon. It's called 12 Rules for Life. Dr. Jordan Peterson, thank you very much for joining us today from Canada.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for the invitation.
Yeah, and thanks for wearing the gel. Looks good.
There you go.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Peterson. All right, we're going to make it weird here.
Our Prime Minister is a great example of that. So back, I think it was in 2015, he announced that half of his cabinet was going to be women because it was 2015 or some like muddle-headed virtue signaling excuse for not thinking. I think only 20% or 25% of the elected MPs were female. So the proper balance on average would have been 25% female, 75% male. What he should have done was figured out what qualities would make for a competent cabinet minister, because it's actually quite important to have competent cabinet ministers, and then selected from among his people for nothing other than competence. But he could virtue signal, and then he set up the most important board, let's say, of the entire country on a quasi-random basis. Jesus, how pathetic. He should have been pilloried by Canadians for that. But we're so clued out, and also in the situation that you described, is like, if I say, well, 50% of Trudeau's cabinet shouldn't have been women. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, announced in 2015 that half the cabinet that he put together would be women, despite the fact that only approximately, I think it was 20 to 25% of the elected officials were female. And so what he basically admitted, as far as I'm concerned, was 2 things. Number 1, he was incapable of judging people on their competence. Because when you put together something like the cabinet for a country, what you do is you find the most competent people, period. Because it's so bizarre that it even has to be said, because it actually turns out that the cabinet is important. And so to me, all he did was default on his central moral obligation to screen every single one of his members of parliament with exceeding care and to pick the most qualified people. And his rationale was that it was 2015. So, and to reduce competence to racial, ethnic, gender identity, something like that, is an absolutely appalling move philosophically as well, as far as I'm concerned, to assume that diversity is somehow represented by group membership. There's no evidence for that. There's absolutely no scientific evidence for that whatsoever. In fact, the scientific evidence suggests quite the contrary, which is that there's more variability within groups than there is between groups, which is actually an antidote to the central racist claim, right? Because the central racist claim is there's more difference between groups than there is difference within them. And so, you've seen one black person, you've seen them all. I think that the Trudeau government is far to the left of where people originally assumed it would be. I mean, I think that his decision to put 50% women in the cabinet was an abdication of responsibility of a magnitude that we haven't seen before in Canadian political history. Only 26% of the MPs elected were female. And that should have been approximately the proportion of cabinet members. But to say this is 2015 or whatever the hell the year was, and then to abdicate his responsibility for selecting the most competent people was an indication of exactly how, what would you say, how suited he is to be prime minister. And people just didn't make much of an issue of that because of their attempts to be tolerant. But I think that what he did was, I thought the fact that he ran to begin with was reprehensible because he ran entirely on the name brand recognition that he had derived from his father.
Yes.
And I think that that's the mark of someone who's narcissistic. He shouldn't have done that. Or
it worked, though. A lot of immigrants voted for him. My dad voted for him.
He's very charismatic and attractive, and he knows how to behave in public. And so, and he had a very, very famous name. But I believe that it was immoral of him to run because we're not dynasties. Democracies aren't dynasties. And he hadn't the CV, the record of success that you would need as an independent individual to justify himself as a qualified candidate for prime minister. So I thought that his candidacy right from the start was ethically flawed. But then to multiply that error with these shallow attempts at broadcasting tolerance, especially at the expense of competence and the capacity to truly evaluate, is just inexcusable. Inexcusable.